Okay, hello. Welcome everyone to the Latter-day Saint Home Educators Wednesday webinar series. LDSHE is an all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to support, strengthen, and inspire Latter-day Saint families in home education. We've been putting on conferences that gather hundreds of LDS homeschoolers from across the country since 2004. Today's presentation is one of many originally prepared to be presented live at our 2020 conference. Our physical conference has been canceled due to coronavirus concerns. So we're embracing our theme, Trust the Journey, and moving forward with this online conference. We hope you'll find motivation, inspiration, and encouragement in today's presentation. A few housekeeping items before we start. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer some questions. So if you have any questions throughout or at the end, if you'll just type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and at the end we will have Nephi address any of those. Replays of this webinar will be available at Latter-day Saint Home Educators Facebook page and on our YouTube channel and website, ldshe.org, by Friday. And we'll be doing this every Wednesday until May 20th at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern. So we welcome you to this, and Nephi will go ahead and turn the time over to you for Creators in a Consumptive World.
Thanks, Allison. You guys, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited. It's tough though, right? Like, it would be so much nicer to be face to face. And I think there's a lot of things that are lost in this type of a situation, but I'm hopeful that as we go through this, one thing I worry about is that you won't feel as much of my passion. It feels like when I stand up in front of you and I can speak, right to your face and see your reactions, I can communicate that better. But I hope that you understand that this topic is, for a long time, has just really been important to me. And it's something that I feel like is a huge concern for the generation that we're raising right now. And it's interesting, before before coronavirus ever happened and we all went to these virtual conferences, it was a big concern to me. But now that this has happened, this idea of creation versus consumption, production versus consumption, has come out and become even more important. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. To get started, I want to start with a short story, kind of kick this off, something that happened to us recently that demonstrated to me why this is such an important topic. This last year, we actually had an exchange student here living with us from Spain. Isa was 16, and she came to live with us last June, and she stayed with us all winter. And we were intending to have her through this June, but of course, because of all of the things that have happened earlier this year, things started to change a little bit. So just so you know Isa a little bit, Isa is this amazing 16-year-old girl that is just full of life and energetic. And when she came into our home, she just brought the energy with her. And she just jumped into everything we do. We're a family that likes to go out and do a lot of adventures. And she jumped in snowmobiling and motorcycle riding and all of the things that we like to do. And so we live in an area where we are able to do a lot of that recreational activity. We're able to be outside a lot. Even during this coronavirus time, we have a property where we can go and we can play and do these things. Well, as this all happened and all this rolled out, the program that she was with started to talk to us about needing to send her home. Now, as most of you know, Spain was a completely different situation than we were. And her family has been on lockdown for a significant amount of time, and a significant lockdown where only one person can leave their apartment at a time to go directly to the store or walk a dog and come home. And that's all they can do. They can't leave their apartment for anything else. And so Isa was a little bit hesitant to go home. And so we communicated with the program, and we talked to her parents, and we all decided it would be better if she stayed here with us. And that was the case for about a week. And then more things happened and more news came out and more flights were canceled. And eventually they made the decision that Isa needed to go home. And so a few weeks ago, we sadly took Isa down to the Salt Lake airport, and she flew home to Spain. And she's been home now for a couple of weeks, and she's been struggling. She's really been struggling because she's locked in this apartment. She doesn't have a lot to do. I mean, she has her family there. They can do things that all of us have had to learn to do. But it was a huge difference and a huge change from, the day before she left our house, we were out riding motorcycles here on our property and taking a hike. And then she goes there and she's locked in her apartment. And it's been really hard. And so she's actually been having a hard time sleeping. She's been having a hard time eating. and it's really starting to affect her. And I wanted to show you guys a text that she sent to me this last week. And let me just get my presentation here. There we go. She says, we were just talking back and forth about her needing to try to stay positive and try to do some things. She says, yeah, I know, but I just can't think about going out and seeing all my friends, my cousins, my grandparents. She can't stop thinking about that. And I can't. I'm stuck at my house with pictures all around my room that they just make me feel sad. And I feel so selfish being here. And I'm glad of being with my parents and brother, and they're happy of having me here, but it's just too much. And I'm trying to do things that I like, but there's just too many times that I don't know how to use. Also, I still have so many assignments from Century. So she's talking about schooling. And I thought that one sentence really stuck out to me. She says, there's so much time that I don't know how to use. And you guys, I don't know how your family is doing, but I think in general, as a society, always, and especially now during coronavirus, it's been hard to know how do we use this time? What should we be doing? And how can we benefit our families, keep them sane at the same time, and try to follow these social distancing and lockdown procedures? And it's been tough. It's a really difficult line to draw in the sand. And I think we all struggle with it just a little bit. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. I want to discuss why I think that these things are happening and why it's so hard. So let's talk for a second about our society in general before coronavirus, right? So we live in an abundant time. We live in an incredible time. And even as we've gone through these difficult times, we can see that technology has advanced so far and has raised the level of everyone's lives. I mean, if you compare even the people that are really poor and not doing so well right now, if you compare those individuals to, let's say, 1860 or 1900, back in time, we are doing so much better as a society than we ever have. And in fact, I would say that we live in a time maybe of more abundance than we've ever had. And yet at the same time, we find that our kids are struggling, and specifically, they're struggling with what I call the Four Horsemen. That's what this image is of, the Four Horsemen. Now, I'm not talking about the Four Horsemen of the actual apocalypse. I'm talking about anxiety, depression, addiction, and suicide. Those four things, every study that we look at, those four things seem to be going up, up, up all the time. And it's at an alarming rate. In fact, so much so that we've begun to be very concerned about what is happening. Why are these kids that live in such an incredibly abundant time, that have so much given to them, why are they struggling with anxiety, depression, addiction, and suicide? And you guys, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So I present quite a bit to groups of youth. And over the last about 6 to 8 months, almost every single time I speak to the youth, I do an activity where I ask all of the kids, I say, if anyone in this room personally, or if someone in your direct family, like parents, siblings, or one of your very close friends is struggling with anxiety, would you please stand up? In almost every single room I go into, everyone stands up. Unsurprisingly, right? Anxiety is something that a lot of us deal with. And then I say, now, if you or someone close to you is struggling with depression, please stay standing and everyone else sit down. And you guys, most of the time, nobody sits down because we all know individuals that are struggling with depression. And then I go a step further. I say, anyone who is struggling with addiction or know someone close to them that's struggling with addiction, please stay standing and everyone else sit down. And in most of the time, nobody sits down, and sometimes a few people sit down, but very few. And then I take it the last step and I say, if any of you are struggling, have considered committing suicide, or know someone who has considered or has committed suicide, please stay standing and everyone else sit up, and everyone else sit down. And you guys, very, very few people sit down. There have been a lot of places where I've had 50 to 100 students and not a single person sits down, even on that question. Now, what I point out to them, and I want to point out to you guys, is that if I had asked those four questions 10 years ago, just 10 years ago, the response would have been very, very different. Something is happening. Something is changing, and it's causing big, big problems for these youth. And so as a society, as researchers, we really want to try to figure this out. We want to know what's causing this. And we don't have all the answers. We don't know exactly what it is. It's obviously a combination of many, many factors. But a couple of things that we do know. Number one, it's probably raw fish. Just kidding. It's not raw fish, but there's actually sushi it has a point. If I told you that as a kid, when I was growing up, we were relatively low income, we were lower class. And we didn't go out to eat very often when I was growing up. We didn't go out to the movies very often. And so when we said what were our favorite meals, we would say like, spaghetti and chili, and those are the tacos, pizza. Those are the types of things that we had that were special to us. And so, but contrast that now with what our kids have and what they go through. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but every year for birthdays, we ask our kids to pick the meals. They get to pick the meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, their favorite meals. And like 3 out of 5 of my kids, for their favorite dinner, pick sushi. Now, that's a little bit, like to us, that's a little unheard of, right? Like I would not have expected that to be the case when we were growing up. And I just realized I have not been sharing my screen. You guys, there you go. Now you can see what I'm talking about, sushi. So we live in a time of incredible abundance. And what does that result in? Why do I talk about this abundance so often? One of the things that we find as we look at the research and we look at the data is that when kids, as they're growing up, as they have more and more free time, and as they spend more and more of that free time doing activities that look like consumption, then it leads to some very dire consequences. And also, we talk about social media, how that can have negative influences and how it can lead to some of these problems that we're dealing with. But really, it's this idea of there's so much abundance, so much free time. We don't ask kids to do the same things that we asked kids to do 30 and 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And it's leading to these higher rates of anxiety, depression, addiction, and suicide. And we have a little bit of research that I want to cover with you guys, a couple of examples of how this plays out, okay? So let's first take addiction. So when we first started trying to figure out what was addiction, it was back in the 50s. We were looking at these highly addictive substances like cocaine and heroin and all of those things, and opioids, and we were trying to figure out what is causing this addiction. And so scientists went and they did some studies. One of the most famous studies, and one that really created much of the policy that we follow, was a study with rats. What they would do is they would take rats and they would put them into cages. And these rats would be given 2 bottles of water. One of the bottles of water would be pure water, and the other bottle of water would be laced with morphine. Now, because morphine was like a bitter substance, they would also add a lot of sugar to it to make it sweet and addictive from the drugs. And so they put these 2 bottles into the cages, and they monitor these rats over a period of time. And they watch them to see which of the 2 bottles they preferred and whether or not they became addicted. And you're probably not surprised to hear that 100% of those rats, every single rat, became addicted to the morphine-laced water. And so then they continued to do these studies. They started to section brains. They started to look at the chemical nature of addiction and decided, look what happens when these rats take morphine the first time. Look at the sensors, the dopamine hits that they get. They monitored all this and started to form what we have as our current policy and our current idea of how addiction occurs, which is, if you ask most people, how does addiction occur? We would say something like, well, people, try it once, they like it, they try it again. And if they hit a certain threshold, if they take it enough times, they get enough of those hits, then they then become addicted. And so we have these policies that we put in place to fight that, the DARE program and Just Say No. All of those things were to try to keep the kids and adults from trying it just that one time because we don't want them to cross that threshold. Well, it was interesting because as we watched in society, this idea that if you take it once and you get over a threshold that you're addicted forever, or you have these addictive tendencies, wasn't playing out in reality. It wasn't how addiction was occurring. And the best example of this happened in the late 60s. It was called Vietnam. In Vietnam, you guys, we had all of these soldiers over there taking really high amounts of addictive drugs. We had a lot of soldiers that were addicted to those drugs over there. And so the policymakers were looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have all of these people come back from Vietnam, and we're going to have this huge addiction problem. And they tried to prepare themselves for it. But guess what happened? We had all of these people come back. We had like 20% of the soldiers addicted over there. When they came back, like we only ended up with maybe 2% of them continuing that usage when they got back. Almost everyone, a majority of those individuals went back to their normal lives and were not addicted to these drugs. Well, that didn't make any sense, because if they had crossed that threshold and they were addicted there, then they should be addicted here. And so it didn't jive. So there was a couple of researchers. One of them was named Bruce Alexander up in Canada, and he was really interested in this. And so he started to study this more in depth, and he decided to rerun the rat study. And so he took rats, he put them into enclosures, and he gave them the 2 bottles of water. He tried to replicate every different piece of the previous study, except this time he changed one factor. In the first study, where every rat became addicted, the rats were placed into these enclosures by themselves, just sterile cages. What Bruce Alexander did was he created what he called Rat Park. And Rat Park was this playground for rats. It had enclosures where they could go in and dig. It had things that they could do. They could walk on the wheel. They could communicate and socialize with other rats. They could produce. They could do all of these things that rats need to do. And really interestingly, at the end of that study, none of the rats became addicted to the morphine-laced water. Every single rat in Rat Park elected to drink pure water. They didn't want the morphine-laced water. And it was this light bulb went on for so many these people that realized, you know what? Absolutely, addiction has a chemical nature. There are dopamine releases. There are all of these things. But there is another level to this. There's a social element and there's a production element. And so as they continued to do more and more research, what they found out was addiction doesn't happen necessarily because of exposure. If you're exposed to something and you take it enough times, you hit it and you hit that threshold, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be addicted. What usually precedes addiction, really interestingly, is loneliness, anxiety, boredom, or other emotional challenges. When we have loneliness, anxiety, and boredom, and then we're exposed to those things, then it results in addiction. And in the absence of those other emotional things, we don't see the addiction happening at the same levels. Now, that's really important to understand. And it's also really awesome because guess what, you guys? In a lot of different ways, we have lost the exposure battle. For years and years and years, we tried to win the exposure battle versus pornography. But pornography is so pernicious now, it's so available now that we've lost that battle. Our kids and us as individuals are going to be exposed to pornography on a relatively regular basis. And it's really, really good to know, and it's really comforting to me to know that just because my kid sees pornography doesn't mean he becomes addicted to pornography. But then as a parent, what does that mean? It means I have to help him combat the feelings of loneliness, boredom, anxiety, so that when he is exposed to pornography, and I hate to say he, but really it's he or she, when they are exposed to pornography, it doesn't become addictive because they don't have those other triggers that are driving that addiction. This is really good news, but it's also really important that we understand that. We have to fight loneliness, boredom, and anxiety more than we have to fight exposure, to be honest. So Rat Park was an important way of seeing that this idea of sitting around consuming, sitting around being lonely and bored and flipping through our smartphones because we're bored and we're lonely, that is a really difficult, or that's a really great way to become addicted. Now, this is crucial, you guys, right now, especially during this lockdown. Are we letting our kids, because they are a little bit lonely, they are a little bit bored, they are anxious, they're feeling those things. Are we allowing them the same unfettered access to these things that we were before? Are we doing things actively to try to combat that loneliness, boredom, and anxiety? Because this is a really crucial time. I don't want to add any more anxiety to your life. I know that this is hard enough already, but I wish more people understood that your kids right now are more susceptible to starting addictive behaviors than they ever have been. But luckily, there's ways to battle that. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's talk about one more example of this production versus consumption, being active versus passive, how it can play out for individuals, and how we see the difference for people. I recently read a book called Endurance. So if any of you guys have a chance to read Endurance, it's this unbelievable tale about Ernest Shackleton. He's one of the people that was trying to be the first to cross Antarctica on the land. And so he made this expedition, the Shackleton expedition, he left on this adventure the day that or like a week after, 6 days after World War I started. So that's about the time period this was happening. But he took this group of men and they sailed down to Antarctica. Now, this is an awesome quote. I love this. So when he was trying to find some people to go on this great adventure with him, this is what he put into the paper. He said, "Men wanted for a hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, honor and recognition in case of success." I love that, right? Like this is going to be terrible, but if we succeed, there might be some honor and recognition. This was what he put into the paper. And you would expect that it wouldn't have garnered too many responses. But in fact, legend says, and we don't know if this actually happened, but it makes such a great story that I tell it anyway. But they say that like 5,000 people showed up to volunteer for the Shackleton expedition as a result of this in the paper. So you can imagine the type of crazy people that were on this expedition with Ernest Shackleton. But what happens is, as they go down there, the ice flows down there. You know, you kind of have to plow through ice, and you have to wait for the ice to open in certain areas and then go through. And so there's certain times of the year that you can traverse through those areas. Well, Shackleton got unlucky this year. The ice was different than it had been in years past. They weren't prepared. And as they were getting down closer to land, they were still over the water. The ice closes in on them and it locks their boat, and it just traps them in the ice. And they spend about, I can't remember exactly, I think 8 to 9 months on this boat. They're able to get off the boat and get onto the ice, but they're stuck right there, and they spend 8 to 9 months waiting there, hoping the ice will open so that they can continue on their journey to land. Well, it never opens. And during this time, it's amazing. I mean, it was an incredibly difficult area. I mean, it's this environment that is insane. The wind is constantly blowing and it's cold, and it hardly ever gets above freezing, and it's wet, and they go through in Endurance, and they talk about all of the challenges that these people faced. But what's really interesting is that every day they would get off the boat, they would go about their activity, they would be productive. They were building things, they were hunting, they were fishing, they were doing all of these productive things to pass their time. They would read a little bit as well, but most of it was done with productive activities. And so it's interesting, even though it was incredibly difficult, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough water, all of these things. You read through their journals in this period of their journey, and it's incredibly positive. Most of them are talking about how fun it was to go out and find this or that, or they killed a seal this day, or they found a leopard seal. And they talk about these crazy adventures, and they're pretty positive. And so it kind of shows, again, the craziness of these individuals to be stuck in the situation, don't know if you're ever going to get out of it, and yet they're still upbeat and happy and everything's good. And Shackleton himself he was always optimistic. He was always telling the men that it was going to be okay. Well, what ends up happening is the ice doesn't open up, and in fact, it gets worse. And as winter closes in, the ice comes together and smashes the boat and destroys it. And they realize they can't stay there anymore, because at some point the ice will open again. And if they are where they are, they're going to be in big trouble. So they put boats on their backs and they start to try to traverse across the ice to get to land. And it's terrible. Every day the ice opens and closes in different areas. In fact, some days they'll pitch their tent, and where they pitch their tent during the night, the ice will open up right underneath their tent, and they have to grab everything and try to keep it out of the water. And some days people are falling in, and then if you fall in, they have to get them up quick because the ice can close quickly as well and cover them up. So it's this insane time. Well, as they continue to journey on, they're still pretty upbeat. They're pretty happy. They get to a point where the ice starts to melt a little bit and it gets slushy, and they can't go on. They can't pull their boats anymore. They can't do anything. And the ice around them is breaking up. And so they find this one floe that is about 2 football fields long in each direction. And they decide that they can't go on and they're going to be stuck there. Well, over a period of time, that ice floe breaks in half, and it breaks in half again and again. And by the end, they have a space, I think that it's about 25 meters by 50 meters. That's the entire space that they live on for months and months. And at this point, they're stuck in their tents because it's incredibly cold. The weather has turned nasty. They can't go out. They do a little bit of hunting, but they can't build anything. They can't do any of those productive activities that they were doing before. And as you start to look at the journals, it's interesting. All of a sudden, we start to see these individuals who are incredibly happy, upbeat, ready to go. They start to get just a little bit, you start to see a downturn. And over that time where they're on that small piece of ice and they can't get out and do things, there starts to be a lot of infighting. There starts to be some depression, a lot of anxiety, fear, and it starts to build up and show in these men, and it starts to wear on them, so much so that their physical health starts to take a toll. Well, you guys, the story goes on. They make it. I'm not ruining the story because most people know that Shackleton's men, they do make it back, but just barely. And you really should read that story because it's incredible. But the point of that, you guys, is that even amongst even in this very, very difficult time, when the men were able to produce, when they were able to create, when they were able to move and do things, they were able to maintain a different mental state than they were when they were stuck in their tents. And when they're in their tents, they weren't doing nothing. They weren't sleeping. They read books over and over and over. These great classic books that they had. They did things, but it was consumption. There was just not much that they could produce other than they could write a little bit and they could do a little bit of music. And that's about it. And everything else was consumption. And so we see in this story, there is true power in production. Production versus consumption is not just something that we say we should be doing because it's good. There is actual power to help our families, to help our kids when they produce. It makes them more resilient. It makes them happier. There's so many positive benefits, and it prepares them for success in a way that consumption never can. Even good consumption. Okay, and I want that to be really clear. Like, production that is not perfect is better than consumption that is. Meaning, if we're reading the best novels and doing the very best consumption we possibly can, it still doesn't compare to the power that we get from creative and productive activities. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. So let's be really clear. I want to define for just a second what it means, what is production and what is consumption. And so yesterday, my kids are great guinea pigs for all the things. I've got this glare right in my face. I'm trying to avoid it, but that's okay. You guys are going to be able to deal with it, I think. So my kids are great examples. So yesterday I went and took some pictures. On the left is my 8-year-old son, Keller. And on the right is my 5-year-old daughter, Melina. So let's talk about Melina first. Melina yesterday, actually 2 days ago, she comes up into my office and she says, "Dad, do you have any old socks that you don't use anymore?" And I said, "Oh, I think we have some old ones that don't have matches. Yeah, she said, "Can I have some?" So I get her some of these old socks and she runs off. And a little while later, she says, "Dad, do you have any more of those socks?" And so I get her a few more and she runs off. Well, long story short, later that evening, she comes to me and she shows me what she has in her hands right now. Now, it's hard to tell from this picture, but she went and she created a little sock penguin. She made the body of the penguin out of the black socks and a little headpiece. She cut out some of the white to make the face, and she made some eyes. And she did this. She's 5 years old, you guys. She did this all on her own. Her mother didn't know she was doing it. She just had this idea that she wanted to try it, and she just started going and trying. And she told me, yeah, I got it kind of wrong the first time and I had to redo it. And she kind of walked me through the process of this creative activity that she did. And so Melina is this amazing example in my family of someone who just loves to create and produce. So when we talk about production, you guys, how I define it is this. It's anything that we do ourselves, we create ourselves that comes out of us. Anything that comes out of us is production. Now, there's an important part to what I just said. Thinking about production, thinking about starting a business, thinking about writing a book, thinking about creating music is not production. It's just thinking. And thinking's great, but it doesn't have the power of production. And so in order for it to count as production, it has to come out of us. Anything that comes out is production. Okay? On the left, Keller. Now, in Keller's defense, don't think he's playing a game. He's actually reading a book. I think he's reading Little Britches, one of the classics that we really like. We don't have it physically, so he's reading it on the phone. But Keller loves to read. He sits around and he reads all the time, and he is a voracious reader. This kid, he blasts, like at 7 years old, he blasted through the Harry Potter series in about a week and a half. He read Fablehaven in about a week, the whole series. Like he just loves to read and he's voracious about it. But we have to monitor him because he gets so into it that he rarely picks his head up to do anything else. But Keller's a great example of a consumer. Consumption is any time we take something that someone else has created and we bring it in. So reading, eating, those types of things, listening to music, and then of course the ones that you were probably thinking when I talked about consumption, which is watching Netflix and videos and playing video games and all of those things. That's all, I put that all into this category of consumption. So creation and production versus consumption. Creation and production goes out from us, production comes in. So that's my definition, and it's the way that I like to talk about it. Define it however you need to, but the point of this is production has huge benefits that creation can't. Now, I'm not saying creation is bad. Excuse me, I'm saying this totally wrong. Production has great benefits that consumption does not. And I'm not saying that consumption is bad. And different levels of consumption are important for us. I'm a huge proponent of consuming the best books and consuming as much as we can of good information and good material. But it's important that we realize that that production or that consumption is not the same as going out and producing something. So that's the framework. I hope that we can all at least agree that there are benefits to production. You may not agree with when I say that production is better than even the best consumption. That's okay. As I look at the data and I look at things that I've seen, I think that that is true. But I hope that we can at least agree that there are great benefits to having kids in our families producing and not consuming. So how do we do that? I want to give you guys, before we end here today, I think we're about halfway through, I want to go through and talk about how we can do that in a better way. And what are some things we can watch for to help our kids want to produce more and consume less, okay? The first thing I want to talk about, though, is consumption. So we all recognize that consumption is it's a spectrum. There's good consumption and there is really bad consumption. And that's different for all of us. Like for me, I put Netflix and video games kind of at my not very good consumption. And I put reading classics up here. Some of you probably agree with that, but others of you may not agree with that. And that's totally fine, because consumption is kind of a personal thing. What we benefit from and what we are strengthened by is different. I will admit that sometimes watching TV or Netflix is invigorating for me because it allows me to shut my brain off and just kind of enjoy something. And so there are times when watching Netflix is very appropriate for me in order to shut down a little bit and to relax. But I do recognize that there is a spectrum. And so you guys, the first thing I want to say is we all need to work personally and with our kids on spending more of our consumption time on better consumption. How can we improve our consumption? So I have a very simple, you guys are going to laugh because it's so simple, but it's actually, if you'll do this, there is power in it. I promise. It seems so simple, but it's really actually pretty powerful. What it looks like is this. I call it the consumption ladder. All you have to do, you've got a ladder. Write down on a piece of paper a ladder. At the top right, at the higher rungs, put down what you think is your best types of consumption. So for me, reading classics, that kind of stuff goes up there. And then list all of the types of consumption and order it in a way. It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't spend a lot of time doing this, but just kind of get a broad stroke of where you think your consumption lies. Up here is when I'm reading. Here is when I'm spending time doing other things. And down here is when I'm just wasting time. Write it all out. And then my challenge to you is this. Recognize, maybe even track for a day, how much time are you and your kids spending doing consumption? And how much time are each of them spending on each of these consumptive areas? Are they spending more consumption time on great consumption, or are they spending more consumption time on kind of crappy consumption? And this isn't crappy according to Nephi, this is a crappy according to you and according to your kids. And by the way, don't do this for your kids. Don't tell them what's crappy and what's good consumption. Allow them to lay it out. But don't tell them what the final is, because at the end, what I want them to do is I want them to more often take one step up in their consumption. So if they're spending a lot of time, hours a day over here on the not so good consumption, then for just a little while, have them, well, not for a little while, but have them look at it and say, I'm going to take this amount of time out of here and I'm going to put it into the middle. I'm going to take this amount out of the middle, I'm going to put it into the top, and just try to move them up that consumption scale. I hope that makes sense. And I know it's super simple, but it's been powerful in my life, and it's been powerful in the life of my kids. And so I hope that you'll at least take a little bit of time this week to lay out your consumption ladder and just decide, what can I do to step up one level? All right? That's all I'm going to say about consumption. Let's talk now about production. And we can't get out of the production versus consumption conversation without talking about devices. All right, so let's talk about devices for just a minute. And this is a really important part of this discussion, I think. I think without a doubt, all of us recognize that devices are taking over the lives of our children and our lives. How many of you guys have a hard time sitting quietly without pulling out your phone? I know that I do. I have some very addictive tendencies when it comes to when it comes to devices. And so I struggle with it. And so it's hard for me to be the guy to stand up and tell my kids, this is exactly how you need to deal with that. Because I think as adults, we're still trying to figure out how to use these devices appropriately. And so the fact of the matter is, devices are here. And we have choices about how we allow our kids to utilize devices. Now, I know there's a lot of families, and our family was this way for a long time, that said no devices. And the research, by the way, you guys, speaks to this. If you dig into all the research that's been done of kids using devices, kids using social media versus not using them, it's not even close to the negative effects that devices have on our kids. I mean, there's just nobody that wants to defend usage of devices could ever say that using a device is not worse than not using a device for our kids. I mean, you just can't. You can't in good conscience say that. But what I want to say today is the perfect says that we shouldn't use devices. That's the perfect. But we don't live in a perfect world. And so, you know, about a year, well, it hasn't been a year, it's probably been more like 8 months. 8 months ago, I was with a group of kids. We were talking about this exact topic. And it was a group of homeschoolers. And I simply asked, how many of you have devices right now? And this was a group of kids probably from like 12 to 17. So about 40% of the kids raised their hand, which across every time I've done this, that's about what it is. About 40% of our kids in homeschool, which by the way is much less than kids that aren't homeschooled, about 40% of them have devices of their own that they use. Now there's different levels of how they use it, where they use it, and all that stuff, but about 40% of them have their own devices. But then I asked a follow-up question to these same kids. I said, of all of you that don't have devices, when you grow up and you leave your family's home, how many of you plan to have a device of your own? And guess what, guys? Like 99.99% of the hands in the room go up. Almost every one of these kids that don't have devices now plan to have devices at some point. And as I saw that, it dawned on me that, you know what? Obviously, having devices is destructive to our kids, much worse than not having devices. But the reality of our situation says our kids will have devices. They will have screens, and they will spend some of their time using those screens in some way. And so we have a choice. We can either say, my kids are not going to have devices now, and they can figure out how to use them when they grow old enough and when they can make their own decisions. It's totally up to them, and I'm fine with that. And I think a lot of us take that perspective. But the other option that we have, and the one that I elect to follow, is this. Our kids are going to have devices. They need to know how to use those devices for productive activities. They need to know how to use those devices to limit the amount of and type of consumption that they have. And I don't want to wait until they've left my house and hope that they figure it out. I want to teach them those things now. I take the analogy of a car. I know my kids are going to have a car someday, but I'm not going to wait for them to leave my house and go off to try to figure it out themselves. I'm going to spend time with them, teaching them how to use that car right now in a controlled setting, in a way that makes sense for them and for us as parents. And so I don't say that just as without any data in backing this up. I want to tell you guys about a study that Caitlin Burnell did in 2019. And Caitlin is just one of many researchers that have been looking at this topic of devices versus not using devices. She kind of looked at this one day and she said, you know what? Everybody's done studies about no device use versus no device use. But she kind of came to the same conclusion that I did. And she said, that's not realistic. Kids are going to have devices. They're going to use social media. And so instead of comparing usage versus no usage, what she looked at was she broke it down into the type of usage. And so she looked at what she called active usage versus passive usage. So not no usage versus usage. She looked at active versus passive. And the way she defined this, really active is productive usage. So people that are working with their devices to create businesses, to communicate with others in a positive way, to do all of these active things, to create music, to create videos, all of that. That's active use. Passive use is people that go out, they get on their device, they consume, they watch videos, they play games, or they get on social media and they just read through other people's lives and they look at all of this. Well, it was interesting when they compared those two different things, what they found was active use is almost as good as no use of these devices. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not the same as no use. But active use is almost as good as no use. And so for me, as I look and I say, the reality is they're going to have it, what's my responsibility? My responsibility is to make sure that their usage is active. I need to make sure that they're using these in an active way so that they can get the benefits of those devices. And so, but it has to be done in a controlled way. So I'm not telling you, don't walk away and say, Nephi told me to give my kid a device. That's not it at all. So it needs to be done in a way that we can still help them learn to use it in a positive way, even when they're consuming. So for us, there are certain places in our house that you can use devices, and there are certain things that you can do on those devices. My kids can work on their businesses. They can create videos. They can create music. They can communicate positively for a period of time with their kids. And it's all done in a central location in our house where they can't fall into some of these other traps. But positive use of devices is actually beneficial for these kids. I mean, imagine a kid that right now who starts his first business, starts his first entrepreneur endeavor, and he learns how to do online marketing, or he learns how to use Facebook for advertising. Instead of using Facebook for consumption, he uses it for production. He learns how to do great videos. Well, guess what? Great videos can be turned into a great business really, really easily. People are always looking for people that know how to make good videos. So if you have a kid that keeps saying, I want to be a YouTube star, he's probably not going to be a YouTube star, but let him create videos, because creating videos is a productive activity. It's production, it's creation, and it has huge positive benefits in his life, and he's learning skill sets that may be applicable later on. And he could start that and turn that into a business. Maybe it's not a YouTube channel, but maybe he starts making videos that he sells in other ways. Maybe people start sending him footage that he learns the editing software, he can create video. There's lots of different things that this can turn into. So take those opportunities. If your kid loves to play Minecraft, well, make sure, give them specific things that they can do within there. If they're creating new worlds, if they're creating new things within there and producing, that's awesome. If your kid loves video games, Well, teach them how to create video games. Teach them how to program a little bit and set them loose creating their own video games. Turn that usage from consumption of device usage from consumption to production. Take it for what it is. I'm not saying that every parent should do that, but what I'm saying is the research that we see shows great benefits in productive, active usage of these devices versus passive usage. So I hope that helped a little bit in what you're struggling with and what you're dealing with. Let's talk about another thing really quickly. This is a great book by Carol Dweck. It's called Mindset. So if you haven't read Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, please do, because it's really, really amazing. But Carol Dweck teaches us that it matters how we motivate our kids to be productive. It matters how we talk to them. So Carol did this amazing research study about 2012. And what she did was she took a group of kids who were all about the same level of mathematical ability. She put them in a room and she gave them all a math test. And they were all capable of taking that test. At the end of the test, she had decided how she wanted to break it up into two groups. She randomly selected the kids into two separate groups. At the end of the test, the kids came forward, and the kids in one group, she graded their test in front of them, and when she would look at them, she'd say, "Hey, great job. You did really well on this. You must be really smart." That was group one. Group two came forward. She graded their test. She looked at them and said, "Hey, you did really well on this test. You must have worked really, really hard." Those are the two groups. You are smart and you worked really, really hard. She then said, "By the way, there's a second test that I'd like you guys to take if you want to. It's a choice. It's a little bit harder than the test that you just took, but I think it would benefit you to take it. Would you be interested in taking the second test?" The kids that she said, "You're smart," about 67, 68% of them elected not to take the test. Of the kids that she said, "You worked really hard," over 90% of the kids elected to take the second test. Again, no difference in capability. The only difference is what she said to them: "You're smart" versus "You worked really, really hard." The study wasn't over. At the end of the second test, she brought all the kids together again, and she said, "There is a third test that you have to take." Now, unbeknownst to the kids, the third test was equivalently difficult to the first test. It was no more or less difficult than the first test that the kids had taken. Same types of problems, just a little bit different problems. She sent them all back out. They took the test. Here's what's interesting. The kids that were told, "Hey, you're smart," they went down 20 percentage points on average on that third test. It was the same as the first, essentially. The kids that were told, "Hey, you worked hard," went up 30 percentage points. There was a 50 percentage point difference between these two groups solely based on "you're smart" versus "you worked really, really hard." So what's happening here, right? Like what is the explanation? There might be several explanations, but one of the ones that they've evaluated pretty significantly over and over is something that I dealt with as a kid. So this is not said to make you think, well, when I was a kid, I was told I was smart. I was one of those kids that, "Hey, you're smart." Now, years later, I realize now I wasn't smart. I was no smarter than anyone else. I was just good at taking tests and good at certain things at school. I was good at school, but I wasn't necessarily more smart than anyone else. But I was told that I was smart. And you guys, it was incredible to me that through my younger years, because I was told I was smart, if I was ever given an opportunity to do something challenging or difficult, or a chance that I could fail, a chance that I could show people that maybe I wasn't so smart, I avoided those things like the plague. Because heaven forbid anyone ever find out that I wasn't smart. And so my ability to do hard things went way down because I was told, "Hey, you're smart." What we find study after study is this: when kids are told you can do hard things, you can work hard, and when you work hard, you can have some success, they are so much better off than told, "Hey, you're intelligent," or "You're smart," or "You're good at this," or "You're a good boy," or "You're either this or this or this." If you praise the effort, now I know you guys know this, but when it comes back to production, right? when it comes back to production. I think sometimes we get into this trap where, and I did this not too long ago. I told my oldest son, actually, my 8-year-old Keller, I said, I want you to create a story. Now, he hates writing, guys. He really struggles with writing. He loves to read, but he doesn't like to write that much. And I said, I don't care what you write. Just write a story. I thought that would motivate him, incentivize him to write a story. And he went and he spent time and he wrote like 2 pages of a story about a dragon. And it was great. It was a great story. And he did a good job. But guess what I did? I blew it with him. As soon as he handed me the paper, I said, this wasn't done neatly. I said, this wasn't the spelling. You look at these spelling errors. And I started to criticize those things. Well, you guys, that's hugely, hugely destructive. I started to tell him these things. Instead of saying, awesome, amazing job in your production, way to work hard, so that he would be motivated to continue to do hard things and to try and fail, I went the other direction. And we do it all the time. We have to be really, really careful of the way that we motivate and incentivize people to produce. Because when they produce, we have all those benefits. And the production itself is what's important. Remember, my son sitting there and writing that story, even though it wasn't done very well, it didn't have great handwriting and his spelling wasn't great, that effort at production was way more beneficial than all of the reading that he does. In certain ways, it had a lot more benefit. But I demotivated the simple production because of my desire to have better production. Be really careful. Let your kids piddle around and do silly things. Let them create crafts that don't have any use. Let them create things that don't make sense to you. Let them do these creative activities that they are engaged in, and inspire them and praise them and motivate them to continue to do that. All right? Let's go one more here. So this last one, looks like one second. There we go. So this last one, if you guys ever need an awesome podcast for your kids, you guys, I'm going to duck down. It says my battery thing. I just realized it's not plugged in. I'm going to duck for just a second. I know that's so unprofessional, but I didn't want my battery to die. So if you guys ever need a podcast that you want to listen to with your kids, Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell is unbelievable. Love Malcolm Gladwell. He's the guy that wrote Tipping Points and several other books that I really, really, really enjoy. But what he does is he goes back and he talks about different aspects of history and how we get it wrong so often. Anyway, so what he talks about in one particular one of his podcasts, which is called Hallelujah, he talks about this idea between genius that we recognize and consider to be genius, and genius that takes a long time to come together. So what he uses, he compares Picasso. So Picasso is this person, and he's young, he's in his early 20s. He comes on the stage of the art world, and he produces all of this prolific art that everybody loves. He's a genius. He does it quick. He has a process. He can knock these things out, and it's unbelievable what he does and how he changes the art world. He's what we consider to be these conceptual creators. He's just really good at it. And I'm guessing you have some kids that are that way. My daughter Melina is that way. She just gets after it. She has a process. She thinks about things methodically, and she just knocks it out of the park, and she's creative and productive. And that's how Picasso was. So some people are Picassos. But he also says some people are Cézanne. So Cézanne is about the same time period as Picasso, is every bit as influential as Picasso ever was. But Cézanne is not this conceptual creator. He doesn't do it fast. In fact, Cézanne oftentimes takes a long time to produce a single piece of art. This is an example, 4 pieces. These are 4 Cézannes of his wife who did a sitting for him, and he tried to paint them. Now, you would expect that maybe the one on the right was his first one, and then the next one was his second, and the top left was his third, and the bottom was his fourth. But that's not the case. Cézanne is different. He doesn't work as these conceptual producers. He starts somewhere in the middle. Actually, the top left one was his first. The bottom left was his second, and the far right is his fourth. But he's this genius that takes a long time to find the genius. And you guys, some of our kids are this way. Sometimes we look at what they're doing in their productive activities and we're like, oh, that's a waste of time. They're not very good at it. They're not doing this, they're not doing that. It's not coming together. But the point of this is sometimes Cezanne just needs patience. Sometimes your Cezanne just needs you to support them so that they can find some of that genius. Some of us are Picasso and some of us are Cezanne. And sometimes Cezanne takes a lot longer to find it, but it doesn't mean it's not there. Now, I'm not saying that we should, if our kid can only do stick drawings and they want to be an artist for their profession someday, there's a time where we can help them move on to other things and find other interests. I'm not saying, you force, let them just do whatever. But I am saying is let them produce the way that they want to produce. Don't structure it too much. Don't guide it too much. Just help. But let that production be what they want it to be. All right, one more. You guys, Angela Duckworth wrote Grit. Awesome, awesome book. She talks about resilience and the ability to overcome things. She created what she called the grit scale. And so asking certain questions, she can figure out how gritty are we? How resilient are we to difficult situations? We definitely need a generation of more resilient and grittier kids. We are struggling as a society right now because we are not gritty. We are not resilient. And we need to help instill this in our kids differently than we ever have. She talks about how she went into the Navy SEAL program. And Navy SEALs obviously is one of the hardest training programs to get through. And they really struggle as an organization, the Navy does, because they don't know who's going to make it at the end. Before Angela Duckworth came in, they thought that the biggest, strongest, smartest people would always make it through, but they weren't seeing that and they didn't know why. And so Duckworth gave the Navy SEALs that were going into these programs her assessment of their grittiness. And come to find out, it wasn't the biggest, strongest, smartest people that made it through. It was the people that had grit and determination. They could fail and move on. They could recognize that they're not the best and move on. And so these are the individuals who really, really excelled. And so you guys, in your production, when your kids are producing, let them fail. And if they're not failing, give them something else that they can fail in. We need kids to learn how to fail better and faster and more effectively and continue forward after they fail. Failure is a great, amazing teaching tool. And in their production, we should be challenging them so that they fail. If they do a great job on what you give them something harder. If they do a great job, give them something harder. Give it to them until they fail, and then help them get better and not fail, and then give them something harder. This grittiness, this determination is what's going to bless their lives long term. All right, last thing, you guys. This is what I call my production consumption ratio. Simply stated, if you take all your free hours in the day, I'm not talking about sleeping, I'm not talking about eating, I'm not talking about if you have to do something, work for someone else or do an assignment for someone else. Those aren't free hours. But let's say I have 8 hours in the day that are free. How many hours then am I using to produce? And I like a ratio of about 0.4. About 40% of my free time I want to be producing. I want my kids to be producing. And that comes from really just talking to some of the most successful people out there. And this ratio came together as a result of that. Most of those successful people were about a 0.4 in their production consumption ratio. It's a great thing to shoot for. And if you get to 0.4, I say go higher, because I don't think if you had 60%, that would be awesome, because the power of production is incredible. So that's what I have. If you guys want any help with this, if you want any resources, Wealth Mentality Families is the company that we have, and you can find us at www.wealthmentalityfamilies.com. We have resources to help your family start businesses, learn some of these principles of wealth, like this consumption production ratio is a principle of success and wealth, abundance mentality, value creation, all those are principles of wealth. And so we have these resources to try to help your family step it up a level. if you want your kids to be productive, starting a business is an awesome way to do it. And guess what? It's awesome. It's also a really awesome way to have them fail, because most of them will fail in those businesses, but that's awesome. There's never a better time for them to fail than right now when they're with you in your house. And if you get them to if you can get them to fail 3 or 4 businesses before they leave your house, the chances of them being successful in a business going forward are way, 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 way higher than if they aren't doing those things. And they're going to have a more successful, more fruitful, more financially independent life. So thank you guys for your attention. Allison, if there are any questions, we can take those now.
Let's see. Okay, we have Cassandra just says, thanks, Nephi. It was awesome. And I'm enjoying the wealth mentality course.
Oh, thank you, Cassandra.
So there you go. Does anyone have any actual questions for Nephi today? I'll give them just a second to type if they're typing.
Okay.
We really appreciated Nephi. This was really good. I've always enjoyed your classes, and so do my kids. They get really excited when they see you. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any. So we'd like to thank everybody, remind everybody that you can find us on Facebook and YouTube, and that we will be back next week. So thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it so much. Looks like we have one more.
Bye-bye. Oh.
We have another. Oh, is this available on demand? She asked.
Oh. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.